The following is a look at the killers of Dead by Daylight and any real-world equivalents they might have. Let's continue. Evan McMillan, aka The Trapper. The Trapper is to Dead by Daylight what the Heavy is to Team Fortress 2, an unofficial mascot and kind of face of the game. Something of a Jason Voorhees XP with the mask and machete, the Trapper is still more than different enough to the famed horror icon. Let's look at Trapper's lore history. Evan McMillan came from a privileged background. His father, Archie McMillan, owned a mine in Seattle, a large city up in Washington state. Coming from money is kind of rare for a murderer, at least if you get caught, but certainly not unheard of. I'm reminded of Charlene Gallego, who, despite having a life most of us could only dream of, became an accomplice to unspeakable darkness when she met her husband, Gerald. That was a particularly nasty one, but it'll forever be unknown just how involved she really was. A key difference is Evan McMillan was, perhaps, corrupted not by a partner, but by a tyrannical father, something I didn't find with Charlene. This makes the Trapper more believable than the real killer accomplice, because an abusive father is a very common element in the perpetrators of violent true crime cases. What's less common is the respect or even admiration Evan had for his authoritarian dad on and off. But it makes me think, did I miss a trick during the project? Maybe it's not uncommon at all. Do serial killers grow to admire tyrants? Looking at my project, did Myra Hindley, for example, respect her cruel patriarch? What about Keith Jesperson or John Robinson or Peter Curtin? We might view what they went through as abuse, but did they grow to side with their abuser? Maybe not even that. Maybe there really was a genuine admiration for their abuser's strength. Of course, some serial killers, like Danny Rolling, I should think were so consumed with hatred for their dads there'd be no respect whatsoever, but with others, who knows? Okay, the 100 SKP was meant to help me reflect on fictional killers, not have the fictional killers make me reflect on my project. But so far there's nothing unreasonable. Archie McMillan, McMillan Sr., is implied to have killed his wife, Evan's mother. Archie also almost certainly killed Evan's uncle under the guise of a bear attack at Shelter Woods, with the details of the story changing each time Archie retells it. Of course, there are no other witnesses. Both of these instances speak to Evan's bereavement and the presence of an extreme family crime, but supposedly Evan doesn't remember his uncle, only knowing that he was a philanthropist and soft touch when it comes to the miners. More on that in a bit. Brazilian serial killer Pedro Filo's father also killed his mother, but other examples of extreme family crime weren't about killing a matriarch. Some were murders outside the family, and some were unspeakable things done to children or to other family members. There were also plenty of fathers that were domestic abusers. Furthermore, McMillan Sr. was never charged for his crimes, unlike the examples from my project, but the son had his suspicions, and who can say how this affected him? Evan McMillan was also beaten by his father as a child, because of course he was. I think he was beaten as an adult as well, and one time so severely it broke his jaw. But the details of the beatings and the bereavement Evan went through aren't explored in any real depth. Both are common in the history of serial killers, contributing mightily to the pain and the despair of many of their trauma histories. Politics also plays a role in this story. The word socialist is even overtly said in relation to Archie McMillan's brother, likely killed off because he was too nice to the mine workers and thus a liability to the family business. Politics often comes up in true crime, but it's relatively rare in serial killers, at least overtly. Yes, there are some Nazi sympathisers like J.P. Franklin and the like, but the real-world politics of violent offenders is much messier and more incoherent than a tightly written fictional narrative. And the motives for Evan McMillan's major crime have a political theme to them, and it was at the order of his likely deranged dad. Now we've reached the crime itself. After being sold out by the very workers he was trying to protect, Evan lured over 100 workers into the mine, and then buried them alive with explosives. It should be stated that Evan McMillan was not a serial killer, but with over 100 murders, he's killed more than most in one fell swoop. So how do I classify this? Spree killer? Terrorism? There was a clear political motive to this attack. Miners in particular are especially iconic in the trade union movement. I think I'll just call Trapper a mass murderer and end it there. 100 people buried alive. It's reminiscent of certain elements from My Bloody Valentine, a slasher from 1981 with its own cult following. It's surely an inspiration for this character. Trapper even has a minor cosmetic. This is alongside the antagonist of most of the films from the Friday the 13th franchise. Evan McMillan's final victim was his own father, left to die from negligence. I'd call that murder by omission of action, but it's not clear just exactly how sadistic Evan really is. Killing one's own father? Yes, there was some of that. Again, Pedro Filo did ultimately kill his dad, but there's only a few other examples. Danny Rolling tried to kill his father but only wounded him, whilst Rasmussen and West were the fathers that killed their children. Edmund Kemper killed his paternal grandparents, and Nanny Doss killed her mother, as well as 2 of her children, her sister, 2 grandsons, a mother-in-law, life insurance. There was a few others who killed their mums, but we'll come back to them. It's also not clear why Evan killed Archie McMillan. Did Evan regret his mass murder? Did he grow to truly hate his father? Did he want to inherit the estate? Or maybe he just went completely insane. Or maybe he just forgot. I don't know. And your own headcanon can fill in that gap. Evan McMillan enforced his father's evil will, and now he does so for the entity. I think Trapper deserves his punishment. But to get back to the main crime, buried alive was also something that came up as a subcategory of cruel and unusual for the worst of the worst. Once again, Gerald Gallego buried at least one of his victims alive, likely by accident, and Ramadan Mansour did this as well. I don't know how deliberate that was though. Outside of serial killers, there are many lists of accidents that happened on the underground, and I'm reminded of terrorists who'd bomb metros and underground railway lines, or the Tokyo sarin gas attacks that killed 14 and injured over 1,000. But burying over 100 people alive and none were rescued? I can't find a real-world criminal that compares, but this sort of thing has happened before. The 2010 Copiapo mining accident is perhaps the best recent example. 33 men were trapped several kilometers underground in a mine in Chile for over 2 months. Luckily for the real world, the rescue effort was a monumental success, with many organisations chipping in to help these men. They all survived, which is a lot more than can be said of the fictional miners in this story. Furthermore, reading about it is rather uplifting as camaraderie helped them through it, and each had their own job to do. Regardless, I'm positive that's the stuff of nightmares for some. The imagination of the horror that must have happened after a cave-in as panic and madness creep in is far more potent, but we don't know anything about the final moments of the men trapped in the McMillan mines. I really don't want to give the wrong impression, though. Mining is very dangerous, hence why the workers really need to be especially militant. I just led with a more heartwarming example because there have been hundreds of incidents where the outcome was much less favourable than what happened in Chile. I'd like to talk about the Upper Big Branch mine disaster that also occurred in 2010, but in West Virginia, USA. A coal dust explosion killed 29 men, and the company, Massey Energy, was held directly responsible due to blatant, repeated, and massive safety violations. It's very easy for me to see clear parallels, not only to the story, not only to any political message, but the sheer contempt of those at the top towards those at the bottom. This led me down a huge rabbit hole, and I couldn't have asked for a worse metaphor. In 1970 in Kentucky, the Hurricane Creek mine disaster occurred, where an explosion killed 39 men, and also has the suspicious political angle to it. The Farmington mine disaster of 1968, also West Virginia, killed 78 men. Again, it wasn't a buried alive kind of situation and was instead an explosion, and again, there were safety violations. The Sago mine disaster of 2006 was another explosion, but it resulted in a cave-in where 13 men were trapped for 2 days. There was only one survivor as the remaining 12 all suffocated. But the worst mining disaster in the history of the USA was the Monongah mining disaster of 1907, West Virginia. An explosion killed 362 men. It's hard to pinpoint when exactly the events of Trapper's Law take place, but it could well be as early as this. The United States has a contemptuous and violent anti-trade union history, but it's unfair to penalise the nation. And besides explosions, flooding is yet another cause for concern. The Knocksinnock mine disaster of 1950 in Ayrshire, Scotland, saw liquid peat and moss flood the mine, trapping over 100 men underground. It took days to reach them and 13 died. The Newton Chickley colliery disaster was a water flood in India in 1954. The flood trapped 112 people. 49 escaped, but the remaining 63 drowned. The worst mining disaster in history happened in China during the Second World War. The Benzihao Honkiku coal mine in Liaoning province killed 1,500 people. Honestly, I could go on for hours, but mining disasters aren't really my area of expertise. Neither are serial killers, honestly. Neither is DBD. It takes more than 2,400 hours to be an expert in something. But maybe I have some expertise in exploring narrative. It states they never proved what happened at the McMillan estate, but it also says what would become known as the worst mass murder in modern history. So it still isn't clear how much of this law was known to the general public of the USA. Unlike the real-world examples, we, the audience, know the McMillan cave-in was a deliberate and premeditated mass murder, not criminal neglect, not partial or massive criminal neglect, and not an honest accident. But what does in-universe history have to say? Perhaps it was all covered up. This is what I meant about filling the gaps with my own headcanon. Doing this project has forced me to take a closer look. But to get back to the real world, what's to say there wasn't something far more sinister with some real cases? The protection of the ruling class and the argument of plausible deniability can go a very long way. And that is the real mystery. What really happened in those mines? So after that history of luxury living and elite conditioning, Evan McMillan becomes the kind of guy who sets steel bear traps in the forest. Yeah, I think there were some problems in development in the early days, but that's understandable. Things change, things get swapped around, and it's far from the only thing. We almost had a Black Meg. Bleg. But this rustic trapper doesn't match the opulent Evan McMillan. He feels more like some kind of lone survivalist. Okay, poor choice of words. Hermit poacher. Whatever, it's a far cry from the pampered man of divided loyalty explored in the Tone Lore. Regardless, he places bear traps now. Maybe it has something to do with the uncle he never met. There never was a bear, just a tyrant he can never really trap. I still like the Trapper, but I think the developers are reluctant to make him competitive. Given he's likely the killer most players will play as and against first, he should be quite welcoming for newer users. So I don't think he'll ever leave the bottom rung of the tier list, but who knows? He keeps getting the odd buff here and there. Is it over then? I don't think so. Even seasoned DBD veterans fall to paranoia when they go against the Trapper, and despite being a very easy killer to play, there is a lot of hidden depth. Trapper mains have found all sorts of strategies and secrets. We can say the same for most killers in this game. There is something deliciously satisfying watching a survivor run towards a primed trap, and there's something so freaking funny about Trapper catching himself. To this day, as someone who runs around a lot, I still get paranoid going against Evan McMillan. This makes Trapper more believable than the real killer accomplice, because an abusive father is a very common element in the perpetrators of violent... a slasher with its own cult following. It's surely an inspiration for this character. Trapper even has a minor cosmetic. This is alongside the antagonist of the... They all survived, which is a lot more than can be said of the fiction.